Tai-Ho Park hunched over a small table in his cramped living quarters on Nexus Station, staring at the glowing numbers on his terminal. His account balance flashed red, only 47 credits remaining. Not even enough for a meal at the station's cheapest food vendor, let alone rent for another week. He ran his fingers through his unwashed hair and sighed deeply. 3 months ago, he had been a respected terraforming engineer with Galatech, helping transform hostile planets into habitable worlds. Then came the company bankruptcy announcement, followed by mass layoffs. Most of his colleagues had enough savings or connections to book passage back to Earth or find new positions. Tai-Ho had neither. The station's recycled air tasted stale as he took a deep breath. The notice on his terminal blinked insistently, final eviction warning. In 2 days, station security would escort him to the deportation bay, where he would be processed and sent back to an overcrowded Earth that had no place for him. He pulled out his last remaining possession of value, a specialized terraforming toolkit that somehow hadn't been repossessed along with his company equipment. The tools were worth something, but not enough to change his situation. Still, he couldn't bring himself to sell them. They represented the last shred of his identity. One more try, he muttered, sending yet another job application to a minor mining operation seeking environmental consultants. The response came back almost immediately. Position filled. The same response he'd received 27 times in the past week. With nothing else to do, Tai-Ho gathered his toolkit and headed to the public gardens in the station's central plaza. At least there, surrounded by the carefully maintained plants, he could pretend he was planetside for a while. The garden's atmosphere systems were always slightly off balance too, a professional irritation he couldn't help but notice every time he visited. He sat on a bench, watching the diverse station inhabitants pass by. Humans were a minority here, outnumbered by at least 6 other spacefaring species. A group of tall, elegant Kaveri moved past, their iridescent scaled skin catching the artificial sunlight. They were the station's elite, wealthy merchants and diplomats who controlled much of the trade in this sector. Tai-Ho had never spoken to one directly. From her vantage point near the garden's central fountain, Neri observed the human with growing interest. 3 standard cycles she had been watching him, noting his routine, his skills, and most importantly, his evident desperation. Her family's ultimatum weighed heavily on her mind. Secure a suitable mate before the lunar cycle ended or be sent to manage family holdings in the outer colonies, effectively ending her political aspirations. Neri's skin shifted subtly, displaying faint patterns of decision-making across her scales. Humans were rare on Nexus Station, making them exotic and potentially valuable for genetic diversity and political connections. This particular human showed remarkable problem-solving abilities. She had observed him making adjustments to the garden's atmospheric controls when he thought no one was looking. Each time, the garden's conditions improved noticeably. She straightened her ceremonial robe, checked that her translator was functioning properly, and approached him directly. "The oxygen levels are 3% below optimal," she said, standing before him. "Yet you improved the carbon dioxide cycling without authorization." Tai-Ho looked up, startled. A Kaveri female was addressing him directly, her scales displaying formal greeting patterns. Her translator conveyed her words with perfect clarity, though there was a musical quality to the artificial voice. "I didn't think anyone noticed," he replied, instinctively starting to stand before remembering that Kaveri considered height changes during conversation to be aggressive. "I notice everything of value," Neri responded. "You have skills, technical knowledge, problem-solving abilities that differ from Kaveri approaches." Tai-Ho shifted uncomfortably. "Are you reporting me? I know I shouldn't have touched the systems, but they were running inefficiently, and the plants were suffering." "I am not station security," she said, her scales displaying amusement patterns. "I am Neri of House Kaveri Tel, 3rd daughter of Elder Suk." Tai-Ho blinked. He was talking to Kaveri nobility. "I'm Tai-Ho Park, former terraforming engineer with Galatech." "Former," Nari repeated. Now unemployed, facing deportation. No credits, no prospects. It wasn't a question. How do you know all that? Taiho asked, unnerved. Information is valuable. I have been observing you. Her scales shifted to a formal business pattern. I require something you possess. You require something I can provide. Taiho's eyes narrowed. I'm not selling my toolkit. It's all I have left. I have no interest in your tools, Nari said. I need a husband. The statement was so unexpected that Taiho laughed, then quickly stopped when he realized she was serious. You need a what? A husband, a mate, a partner recognized by Kaveri law. Her translator gave the words different inflections. My family requires me to secure a suitable union before the lunar cycle ends. If I fail, I lose my position here. Taiho shook his head in confusion. And you're asking me? A broke human you don't even know. I know enough. Nari replied. Humans are rare. Your species' adaptability is valued. Your technical skills are impressive despite your circumstances. Her scales shifted to display a financial pattern. I offer a mutually beneficial arrangement. Marriage under Kaveri law would grant you citizenship rights, financial security, and social standing. I gain the prestige of a rare human connection and fulfill my family obligations. Taiho stared at her. You're proposing a business deal. Marriage is a contract. Is this not how humans also approach it? Legal benefits, shared resources, social recognition. Nari tilted her head. The arrangement would have clear terms, no emotional demands. Financial support for you, social advancement for me. As absurd as it seemed, Taiho couldn't help considering it. His alternatives were non-existent. Deportation to Earth meant returning to overcrowded shelters and unemployment lines. And there was something intriguing about this strange alien and her direct approach. Your family would accept this, a human with no money or connections. Nari's scales rippled with determination. They will, once I demonstrate your value. Come to the Kaveri Embassy sector tomorrow. We will discuss terms. She handed him a small access chip. This will grant you entry. Do not be late. Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, her graceful movements drawing glances from passers-by. Taiho looked down at the chip in his hand, its surface etched with elaborate Kaveri symbols. Either this was an elaborate joke, some kind of scam, or the most unusual opportunity he'd ever been offered. With nothing left to lose, he decided to find out which. The Kaveri Embassy sector gleamed with polished blue-green stone and living metal that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the station. Taiho stood at the entrance, feeling woefully underdressed in his cleanest but still worn work clothes. He had spent his last credits on a sonic shower and basic grooming, hoping to appear somewhat presentable. Two tall Kaveri guards watched him approach, their scales shifting to display caution patterns. Taiho held up the access chip Nari had given him. I'm here to see Nari of House Kaveri Tell, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The guards exchanged glances, their compound eyes reflecting the station lights. One took the chip, examining it before inserting it into a verification slot. After a moment, the doors slid open. Proceed, human, the guard said, the translator giving his words a clipped tone. You will be escorted. A smaller Kaveri with pale yellow scales appeared and motioned for Taiho to follow. They walked through corridors filled with plants Taiho had never seen before, some glowing with bioluminescence. The air was warmer and more humid than in the general station areas, clearly adjusted to Kaveri preferences. The family awaits in the greeting chamber, the escort said, stopping before an ornate door. Bow to Elder Suk first. Do not make direct eye contact until invited. Before Taiho could ask for more instructions, the door opened, and he was ushered into a large circular room. 7 Kaveri sat in a semicircle on raised platforms. In the center stood Nari, her scales displaying formal patterns in deep blue and gold. Taiho Park of Earth, announced the escort before withdrawing. All eyes turned to him. Taiho remembered the instruction and bowed deeply toward the central figure. an elderly Kaveri whose scales had faded to a pale greenish-white with age. "So this is your solution, daughter." Elder Suk's voice was deeper than Nari's, the translator barely capturing the rumbling undertones. A human with no clan, no resources, no standing. "Father, I have explained his potential value," Nari replied, her stance respectful but firm. Another Kaveri, younger and with vibrant red patterns on his scales, made a dismissive gesture. "Humans are barely established in the galactic community. Their technology is derivative, their culture simplistic." Tai-Ho felt his face grow hot, but kept his expression neutral. He hadn't expected to be discussed, as if he weren't present. "The human may speak," Elder Suk announced suddenly. "Tell us, Tai-Ho Park, why should House Kaveri Tel consider you worthy of alliance?" Tai-Ho straightened and looked directly at Elder Suk, now that he had been invited to do so. "I am a terraforming engineer with 12 years of experience transforming hostile environments into habitable ones. My specialty is atmospheric and hydrological systems integration." The red-scaled Kaveri, Nari's brother, Tai-Ho guessed, made a sound that the translator didn't capture. "Many species can terraform. The Kaveri have been doing so for centuries." With respect, Tai-Ho countered, "Humans approach terraforming differently. We adapt to environments rather than simply reshaping them to a standard template." As if on cue, the lights flickered, and a slight hissing sound came from the ventilation system. Elder Suk looked annoyed. "The atmospheric regulators again," he said. "Our engineers have been attempting repairs for 3 cycles without success." Tai-Ho glanced at the ceiling vents, then at the complex control panel on the wall. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the panel. After a moment of silence, Elder Suk nodded. Tai-Ho approached the panel and studied it, quickly recognizing the basic principles despite the unfamiliar interface. He opened his toolkit, which the guards had surprisingly allowed him to keep, and extracted a small scanner. "Your system is using biofilters with Kaveri algae strains, correct?" Tai-Ho asked as he worked. "Of course," replied an older female Kaveri. "All our environmental systems use our native biological components." Tai-Ho nodded as the scanner displayed results. "That's the issue. The algae has adapted to your cleaning protocols. It's evolved resistance." He pointed to microscopic readings on his scanner. "See these cellular changes? The algae now treats your standard purification cycle as a growth stimulant." The room went silent. Tai-Ho continued, "It's not a mechanical failure. It's biological evolution. Something humans have extensive experience with. I can modify the cleaning protocol to account for this adaptation." With careful movements, he adjusted settings on the panel, recalibrating the system. Within minutes, the hissing stopped, and the air quality indicator shifted from amber to green. "A temporary solution," the red-scaled Kaveri said dismissively. "Actually," Tai-Ho replied, "I've programmed a rotating purification cycle that should prevent future adaptations. It's a technique we developed for Mars habitats where similar problems occurred." Elder Suk's compound eyes studied Tai-Ho with new interest. "You solved in moments what our specialists could not in days." "Different perspective, not superior knowledge," Tai-Ho said carefully. "Humans have spent our history adapting to Earth's constantly changing conditions. We expect adaptation and plan for it." Nari stepped forward, her scales displaying satisfaction. "This demonstrates what I explained, Father. Human ingenuity combined with Kaveri resources could create significant advantages." Elder Suk was silent for a long moment before speaking. "Your proposal has merit, daughter, but requires further testing. The human will face 3 challenges to prove his value to our house." He turned to Tai-Ho. "Succeed, and we will consider this unusual arrangement. Fail, and you leave with nothing." "What are these challenges?" Tai-Ho asked. "The first is technical. You will repair a malfunctioning terraforming array on the agricultural level. The second is social. You must represent House Kaveri Tel at a trade gathering. The third," Elder Suk's scales darkened, The third challenge will be revealed when the time comes. The meeting concluded shortly after, with Taiho escorted to quarters within the Kaveri embassy, small by their standards but luxurious compared to his previous lodging. As the door closed behind him, he sat heavily on the bed, trying to process what had happened. "You have 3 days to prepare for the first challenge," Neri said, entering after a brief knock. "I will help you." "This is crazy," Taiho said. "Your family clearly doesn't approve." "They will," Neri replied confidently. "My brother Jun particularly opposes the arrangement. He stands to gain if I am sent to the outer colonies." Over the next days, Neri taught Taiho basic Kaveri customs and technical terminology, while he shared human approaches to environmental engineering. Their sessions were initially formal but gradually relaxed as they discovered shared interests in xenobiology and station politics. "Why me?" Taiho asked one evening as they reviewed technical specifications. There must be more suitable candidates. Neri's scales shifted to a pattern Taiho hadn't seen before. Kaveri value genetic diversity and innovative thinking. "You demonstrated both." She paused. "And you treated the garden plants with care when you thought no one was watching." Character reveals itself in private actions. For the first time, Taiho wondered if this arrangement might become more than a mere transaction. The thought both intrigued and terrified him as the first challenge approached. Alarms blared throughout the agricultural level of Nexus Station, their piercing wails echoing across the vast hydroponics chambers. Emergency lights bathed the normally white corridors in pulsing red. Station personnel rushed in all directions as Taiho followed Neri and Elder Suk toward the central control hub. "The timing is unfortunate," Elder Suk remarked, his scales displaying concerned patterns, "but perhaps appropriate for your first challenge." Taiho carried his toolkit, mentally reviewing everything Neri had taught him about Kaveri agricultural systems. The station manager, a tall human woman named Director Hayes, met them at the entrance to the control room. "3 sectors of hydroponics are failing," she explained briskly. "Environmental controls went haywire 2 hours ago. Temperature spikes followed by rapid cooling. We've lost 20% of the crop already." Inside the control room, technicians from various species worked frantically at terminals. Large display screens showed wilting plants and fluctuating temperature readings. A Kaveri engineer approached Elder Suk with obvious deference. "The terraforming array is beyond repair," he stated flatly. "The primary regulation modules have fused completely. We recommend shutting down all affected sectors and starting over once replacement parts arrive." "That would mean food rationing for at least 3 cycles," Director Hayes said, shaking her head. "We can't afford that kind of shortage." Elder Suk turned to Taiho. "This is your challenge, human. Solve it." All eyes in the control room turned to Taiho. He felt a momentary flash of panic, then took a deep breath. This was what he was trained for. "I need to see the central array first," he said with more confidence than he felt. The failing hydroponics chamber was a nightmare of contradictions, some areas scorching hot, others nearly freezing. Plants drooped and withered under the stress. The terraforming array that regulated the entire environment stood in the center, a complex machine twice Taiho's height. Smoke rose from its upper housing. Taiho opened an access panel and winced. The internal components were indeed fused beyond repair, just as the Kaveri engineer had said. Traditional approaches would be useless here. "May I access the system schematics?" he asked a nearby technician, who provided a tablet with the requested information. For 20 minutes, Taiho studied the diagrams in silence, occasionally touching the damaged array or checking readings with his scanner. Neri waited nearby, her scales neutral, though Taiho had learned to recognize the slight ripple that indicated anxiety. "I can't fix this," Taiho finally announced. Elder Suk's scales darkened with disappointment. Several observers, including Jun, who had appeared to witness the challenge, displayed satisfaction patterns. However, Taiho continued, "We don't need to fix it. We need to bypass it." He turned to Director Hayes. This station was built in sections, correct? Each with independent environmental systems that were later integrated. Yes, she confirmed. This agricultural level was originally 3 separate modules before expansion. Then the solution isn't to repair the array. It's to create a cascade system. Tahoe pointed to the schematics. We can reconfigure the functional arrays in sectors 4 and 6 to extend their range, creating overlapping fields that cover the damaged sectors. Impossible, stated the Kaveri engineer. The arrays aren't designed for extended coverage. On Kaveri worlds, perhaps, Tahoe replied. But humans faced similar problems during the Mars crisis. We developed protocols for emergency reconfiguration. Without waiting for approval, Tahoe began reprogramming the nearest terminal, his fingers flying across the unfamiliar interface. After a few minutes, he looked up. I need physical access to the secondary arrays in both adjacent sectors. And I'll need 3 technicians who can follow precise instructions. What followed was 4 hours of intense work. Tahoe moved between sectors, recalibrating systems that were never designed to work together. He crawled through maintenance tunnels, rewired control nodes, and twice had to stop to explain his unorthodox approach to skeptical station engineers. When he finally returned to the control room, sweat-soaked and exhausted, the mood had changed. The alarm had stopped, and the environmental readings were stabilizing across all sectors. The system is responding, announced a surprised technician. Temperature variance is down to acceptable levels. Director Hayes studied the readings with astonishment. These production estimates, they're higher than before the failure. How is that possible? The cascade approach actually creates microenvironments better suited to different crop varieties, Tahoe explained, accepting a towel from Nari to wipe his face. It's less efficient energy-wise, but more productive biologically. The effect should last until proper repairs can be made. Elder Sook's scales displayed an approval pattern Tahoe had never seen before. Most impressive, Tahoe Park. You not only solved the crisis but improved upon the original system. June stepped forward, his scales showing forced politeness. A lucky solution. The social challenge will be less forgiving of human improvisation. Later that evening, Tahoe attended his first Kaveri clan gathering as Nari's official candidate. The grand hall of the embassy sector glittered with bioluminescent decorations. Kaveri nobles from various houses mingled, their scales displaying a dazzling array of status and affiliation patterns. Remember, Nari whispered as they entered, formal greetings to elders first, then house allies. The Tivan clan particularly dislikes humans, so be cautious. Tahoe nodded, feeling absurdly out of place in the formal Kaveri attire Nari had provided. The garments were designed for Kaveri physiology, adapted as best possible for his human frame. Throughout the room, compound eyes turned to observe him, some with curiosity, others with obvious disdain. Elder Sook presented Tahoe formally to the gathered clans, emphasizing his role in resolving the agricultural crisis. Some elders displayed interest patterns, while others remained pointedly neutral. As the evening progressed, Tahoe navigated increasingly complex social interactions. He was careful to observe proper protocols, though he occasionally relied on human charm when unsure of Kaveri customs. To his surprise, several younger Kaveri seemed genuinely interested in his perspectives on terraforming. The atmosphere shifted abruptly when June approached with a Kaveri from another clan, one whose scales displayed the distinctive patterns of House Tiven. Cousin Han wishes to discuss human presence on the Trade Council. June announced loudly enough for nearby conversations to halt. Han's scales rippled with challenge patterns. Your arrangement dishonors us all, he stated directly to Nari. A human cannot understand our traditions or represent our interests. This partnership threatens established order. The gathering grew quiet. Tahoe felt dozens of compound eyes watching, evaluating his response. Nari's scales displayed subtle warning patterns, cautioning him to tread carefully. Instead, Tahoe did something unexpected. He raised his drinking vessel in a traditional Kaveri gesture that Nari had taught him. To new perspectives, he said clearly. The universe teaches us that adaptation brings strength. The Kaveri mastered space travel by studying other species' approaches. Humans survived on Earth by embracing change. Perhaps together, we see what neither can alone. A murmur ran through the gathering. Such directness was unusual in Kaveri diplomatic circles, yet the sentiment resonated with many progressive clan members. Elder Sook's scales displayed amusement and approval. Han's scales darkened with frustration, his planned confrontation diffused by Taeho's unexpected response. With minimal politeness, he withdrew, Jun following with scales showing annoyance. That was unorthodox, Neri said when they had a moment alone. But effective. Taeho smiled slightly. Sometimes human directness has advantages. As they walked back to their respective quarters later that night, Taeho realized something unexpected. His practiced politeness toward Neri had somewhere transformed into genuine respect. Her intelligence, adaptability, and quiet determination impressed him more each day. He wondered if the feeling might be mutual, noticing how her scales sometimes displayed patterns not found in any of the reference materials she had provided him, patterns that appeared only when they worked closely together. The maintenance pod drifted silently through space, its navigation lights blinking weakly against the vast backdrop of stars. Inside, Taeho worked frantically at the control panel, his breath coming in quick gasps as the oxygen level indicator continued its steady decline toward the red zone. Station control, this is Maintenance Pod 17. He called again, receiving only static in response, experiencing critical systems failure. Navigation and propulsion offline. Life support compromised. This was supposed to be a routine repair mission, the third and final challenge. Elder Sook had assigned him to fix a malfunctioning communications relay on the station's outer hull, a simple task for someone with his skills. Too simple, perhaps. Warning alarms blared as the pod's stabilizers failed completely, sending it into a slow spin. Through the viewport, Taeho could see Nexus Station growing smaller as the pod drifted farther away. At the current rate, he had less than 40 minutes of breathable air remaining. He pried open an access panel beneath the console, revealing a tangle of wiring and circuit boards. The damage was immediately obvious, and clearly deliberate. Someone had carefully severed key connections and reprogrammed the emergency protocols. This was sabotage. Han, Taeho muttered, recalling the Tivin clan members' hostile glares during recent encounters. Or perhaps Jun, seeking to eliminate the human who threatened his position in the family. On the station, Neri paced in Elder Sook's private chambers, her scales flashing urgent patterns as she confronted her father. The pod's emergency beacon has failed, she said. Communications are down. This is not coincidence. Elder Sook remained outwardly calm, though his scales displayed subtle concern. The final challenge tests resourcefulness in crisis. Perhaps. No, Neri interrupted, a serious breach of protocol that caused several family members to display shock patterns. This goes beyond testing. The pod's trajectory is taking it dangerously close to the station's reactor exhaust path. You suggest deliberate interference. Elder Sook's compound eyes narrowed. I do. Neri's scales shifted to formal accusation patterns. And while we debate, Taeho's oxygen depletes. The elder Kaveri studied his daughter with new intensity, noting patterns in her scales that tradition rarely acknowledged. The deep blues and golds of genuine attachment. You care for this human beyond our arrangement, he stated. Neri did not deny it. I request emergency authorization for a rescue vessel. Cousin Han, and I strongly advise against intervention, Jun said, entering the chamber with Han close behind. The human's failure demonstrates unsuitability for alliance. Failure implies fair challenge, Neri countered. The pod was sabotage. Han's scales displayed indignation. A serious accusation without evidence. Evidence can be gathered later, Neri replied, her scales now displaying a determination pattern so intense that even Jun stepped back slightly. "Father, I formally invoke family protection right. If Taiho dies, our house loses valuable knowledge and potential alliance opportunities." It was a clever approach, appealing to practical benefits rather than personal feelings. After a tense moment, Elder Suk nodded. "Authorization granted," he said. "But you go alone. None will risk themselves for your human." Neri was already moving toward the door. "I require no assistance." In the drifting pod, Taiho had stopped trying to repair the communication system. With oxygen levels dropping below critical, he focused instead on an unorthodox solution. His terraforming experience included emergency protocols for habitat breaches, ways to maximize available air. He dismantled the pod's environmental filter, extracting components that contained synthetic algae used for air purification. Using tools from his kit and materials from the emergency supplies, he constructed a crude but functional recycler. "Basic chemistry," he murmured to himself as he worked. "Convert carbon dioxide back to oxygen. Not efficient, but might buy some time." The makeshift device hummed to life, its effectiveness indicated by the slowing decline of the oxygen level indicator. Instead of minutes, he now had perhaps an hour. Not enough for rescue unless someone realized his situation soon, but better than nothing. The pod continued its slow tumble, now drifting dangerously close to the high-energy particles streaming from the station's reactor exhaust. If the radiation didn't kill them, the heat eventually would, even with the pod's shielding. Taiho allowed himself a moment of bitter amusement. After surviving company bankruptcy, near deportation, and 2 challenging tests, he would die because someone couldn't accept a human in their precious social hierarchy. A sudden flash of light caught his attention. Through the viewport, he spotted a small vessel approaching rapidly, maneuvering with precision through the dangerous area near the reactor exhaust. Its design was distinctly Kaveri, sleeker than standard station maintenance craft. His communication system crackled unexpectedly to life. "Taiho Park, respond if you can hear this transmission." Neri's voice, tense but controlled. "I hear you," he replied, relief flooding through him. "Life support critical but stable for now. Navigation and propulsion dead. Preparing for emergency docking. Stand by." The rescue vessel aligned itself with the damaged pod, magnetic clamps engaging with a dull thud that reverberated through the hull. After a series of mechanical sounds, the airlock cycled open, and Neri entered, her environmental suit adapted for her Kaveri physiology. "You came alone?" Taiho asked, surprised. Others were hesitant. Her scales displayed patterns partially obscured by her suit, but Taiho recognized concern and relief. As they transferred to her vessel, Taiho explained the sabotage while showing her his improvised oxygen recycler. "Clever solution," she acknowledged. "Few Kaveri would think to repurpose components so completely." "Humans adapt," he replied simply. "It's what we do best." Upon their return to the station, they were immediately summoned to an emergency council meeting. News of the incident had spread quickly. Representatives from major clans and station administration had gathered, creating an unexpectedly public forum. Elder Suk presided, his scales displaying formal judicial patterns. Han and Jun stood to one side, their scales carefully neutral. "Serious accusations have been made," Elder Suk announced. "Evidence of deliberate sabotage has been found in the maintenance pod systems." Director Hayes stepped forward. "Station security has confirmed tampering occurred during pre-launch checks. The investigation continues, but the saboteur clearly intended harm." Han moved forward. "Even if true, this arrangement remains inappropriate. A marriage of convenience between species violates traditional values." Traditional values. Taiho finally spoke, his patience exhausted. "Was it traditional values that nearly killed me today?" Before Han could respond, Taiho addressed the entire gathering. "Yes, this began as a business arrangement. Nari needed a husband. I needed a future. But in working together, we discovered something more valuable." He activated his tablet, displaying technical schematics. This is a new terraforming approach combining Kaveri biological engineering with human adaptive algorithms. Initial simulations show 30% greater efficiency than current methods. The room went silent as the implications became clear. Such technology would be immensely valuable in disputed border regions. House Kaveri Tel would control this innovation, Taeho continued. It could transform contested worlds, create new habitable environments. But it requires both perspectives, Kaveri and human, working together. Director Hayes studied the schematics with obvious interest. Station administration would support such development. The potential benefits are substantial. As murmurs of discussion spread through the gathering, Neri stepped forward to stand beside Taeho, her scales now openly displaying the blue-gold patterns of attachment. This partnership began as convenience, she stated clearly, but has become something neither of us anticipated. Something more valuable than tradition alone. The meeting concluded with no formal decision, but the balance had shifted. With station administration's interest and the economic potential of their joint research, opposition from traditional factions appeared increasingly futile. Later, alone in a quiet corner of the garden where they had first met, Taeho and Neri finally addressed what both had been avoiding. "You risk your standing to save me," Taeho said quietly. "Yes," she replied, her scales displaying the patterns he now recognized clearly. "And you would have done the same." In that moment, both realized their arrangement had transformed into something neither had planned for. A partnership based on more than mere convenience. 1 year after the pod incident, Taeho stood at the observation window of Nexus Station's launch bay. Below, workers prepared the research vessel New Horizon for its maiden voyage. The ship featured a unique design, human engineering principles combined with Kaveri biological components. Like their partnership, it represented the best of both worlds. "Final preparations are complete," Neri said, joining him at the window. Her scales displayed the deep blue-gold patterns that Taeho had come to recognize as contentment. "The terraforming equipment is secured. We launch in 3 hours." Taeho nodded, still amazed at how much had changed. The Taeho-Nari Cooperative had grown from a desperate arrangement into the most successful joint human-Kaveri venture in the sector. Their marriage, once a business transaction, was now recognized as a model for interspecies collaboration. "Did you ever imagine this outcome when you approached me that day in the garden?" Taeho asked, reaching out to take her hand, a human gesture she had grown to appreciate. "I needed a solution to a problem," Neri replied, her scales rippling with amusement. "I found something more valuable." The investigation following the sabotage incident had revealed Han's involvement, with June's tacit support, rather than the severe punishment Kaveri law permitted. Neri and Taeho had recommended a different approach. Both were now working in the cooperative's research division under close supervision, their knowledge too valuable to waste. "Elder Suk is waiting in the briefing room," Neri said. The consortium representatives arrived early. They walked through corridors that had once seemed alien to Taeho, but now felt like home. Station residents of various species nodded in greeting as they passed. The odd couple had become respected figures on Nexus. In the briefing room, Elder Suk sat at the head of a large table, his once pale scales now showing stronger color thanks to a treatment developed through human-Kaveri medical cooperation. Around him sat representatives from 3 planetary governments and 2 major corporations, all interested in the new terraforming technology. "Ah, the architects of our venture," Elder Suk said, his translator conveying warm tones. "Please share the final projections for the Taurus mission." Taeho activated the holographic display in the center of the table. A barren moon appeared, rotating slowly to show its cratered, lifeless surface. "Taurus moon has been contested by 3 governments for decades," he explained. Previous terraforming attempts failed because traditional methods couldn't adapt to the moon's unusual radiation patterns. Neri continued seamlessly. "Our approach doesn't fight the natural conditions. Instead, we work with them." The hologram shifted to show the same moon transformed, with areas of blue water and green vegetation. By incorporating radiation-tolerant organisms with adaptive engineering, we create sustainable ecosystems that evolve with the environment. The corporate representative leaned forward. Projected completion time: 18 months for initial habitability, Taiho replied. Full ecosystem stability within 5 years. That's 1/3 the time of conventional methods. With significantly lower resource requirements, Nari added. The process becomes self-sustaining after the first phase. The meeting continued for another hour, with technical questions answered and contracts finalized. When the representatives departed, Elder Suk remained, his scales displaying familial pride. You have transformed more than a moon, he said. 1 year ago, many believed your partnership would fail. Now they seek to create their own versions. It was true. Since their success, 5 other human Kaveri partnerships have formed on Nexus Station, with more developing on other stations throughout the sector. What began as a desperate deal between 2 individuals had sparked a cultural shift. Later, as they prepared for the launch, Taiho and Nari visited the station's central plaza garden where they had first met. The garden had also changed. New hybrid plants developed through their research now grew alongside traditional varieties, creating an environment that suited multiple species. Remember how you fix the oxygen levels here? Nari asked, her scales displaying fondness. That was when I knew you had potential. I was just trying to keep the plants alive. Taiho replied with a smile. I never imagined where it would lead. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small group of humans and Kaveri. Among them was Minji, a young human engineer recently hired by their cooperative, and Da, a junior member of House Kaveri Telephone. Their scales displayed the subtle patterns of early attachment, though both tried to maintain professional demeanors. We've completed the final systems check on the atmospheric processors, Minji reported. Everything is ready for launch. The biological components have been properly synchronized, Dai added. Growth projections exceed our initial estimates. Taiho and Neri exchanged knowing glances. Their own story was repeating itself through a new generation of collaborators. Join us for the pre-launch meal, Neri invited them. We have much to discuss about the future. As they walked toward the Kaveri dining hall, Taiho noticed Han observing them from a distance. After his role in the sabotage was revealed, Han had faced significant loss of status. Yet recently, he had shown growing interest in the cooperative's work, his traditional views gradually giving way to practical reality. Taiho nodded to him, receiving a hesitant nod in return. Not friendship, but progress. 3 hours later, the New Horizon disengaged from Nexus Station, its hybrid engines glowing with a distinctive blue-green light. On the bridge, Taiho and Neri took their positions at the central console, their movements coordinated through months of training together. Course set for Taurus Moon, Taiho announced. Engines at optimal capacity. Environmental systems fully operational, Nari added. Biological components responding normally. The small crew, carefully selected from both species, worked with quiet efficiency around them. Through the main viewport, Nexus Station grew smaller as they accelerated toward their destination. 1 year ago, I was facing deportation with nothing but a toolkit to my name. Taiho said quietly to Nari as the ship entered its cruising phase. And I was facing exile to the outer colonies, she replied, her scales displaying the deep patterns that only Taiho could fully interpret now. We each sought a simple solution. Instead, we found a new horizon, he said, watching as the ship that bore that name carried them toward a future neither could have imagined alone. Behind them, in the ship's research bay, the first seedlings of their new terraforming approach already grew in specialized chambers. Plants that combined Kaveri cellular structures with human adaptive genetics, organisms that could thrive where nothing had grown before. Like their creators, these hybrids represented not just the future of terraforming, but a new understanding of what was possible when different worlds came together. As Taurus Moon appeared on their long-range sensors, Taiho and Neri exchanged a glance that needed no translation. What had begun as a business transaction had become something far more valuable, a partnership that would transform worlds, both literally and figuratively. The human had found more than money. The alien had found more than a husband. Together, they had created possibilities neither species could have achieved alone.